Well, hello, friends. It is time for Between Two Sundays, the show where this guy here, Mark Beresford, and this guy here, Mark Gladman, spend some time talking to you about the readings in the Revised Common Lectionary. We're chatting about what we've seen, what we've felt, what we've noticed, sometimes what we've studied, and in the hopes that it will help you reflect more and more on the readings for each coming week as we approach Sunday and hear them read in our churches. Hello, Mark Beresford.
How are you, Mark Ledman?
I'm well, thank you. Good to have you as always, hanging together doing this. Of course, we start the show off by having a chat about the readings from last week and how we've grown out of them into where we are right now between the two Sundays. And last week, we had the readings for the fifth Sunday after Pentecost, Genesis 22, 1 to 14, Psalm 13, Romans 6, verses 12 to 23, and Matthew 10, verses 40 to 42. Mate, what stuck for me, interesting, was out of the Genesis reading. And it was the very first verse of Genesis 22. I sat down later on and read them again after we'd spent some time reflecting in preparation for Sunday. And in that verse simply says, after these things God tested Abraham, he said to him, Abraham, and Abraham said, here I am. And I kind of went, that's where it all starts, doesn't it? It starts with a response to the prompting of God. Whether it's a test, a call, whatever it happens to be, it starts with the prompting of God calling our name. And the question is, are we ready and willing to respond with, here I am? As a Benedictine, one of the prayers we often pray at the end of our evening office is not the Benedictus, the Angelus, which is a prayer that's from Catholic tradition, but it takes three of the key phrases from when the angel visited Mary and reflects on each one. And the second one is basically, be it unto me according to your word. And it's a reminder every time we pray it that our response to God, if we want to see something happen in our lives, is to answer yes to what God is seemingly calling us to do. And this was a reminder of that. The whole journey that Abraham took began with a yes, and it was a series of yeses that came after that, that not just happened to Abraham, but happened to others that built things. And I guess it's that idea that we will see things happen when we respond yes, when we're willing to risk it and step out into what God seemingly called us to do and test the waters. Even if you want to get technical, Peter's yes to Jesus' invitation to walk out on the water, the blind man's yes to Jesus' response to, go wash yourself in the pool. Matthew's yes and Zacchaeus's yes to Jesus, follow me, or I'm coming to have lunch at your place now. All these yeses that came, here I am's that came, and it just really made me think about the importance of that response is, here I am, what are we doing, where are we going? So yeah, that's what gripped me that I've carried into this week. What about you?
That's amazing because I've gone to the complete other end of the collection of readings here and come to exactly the same conclusion. So I've been struck by whoever gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones in the name of a disciple, truly I tell you, none of these will lose their reward. And every time I read that, and there are other passages in the New Testament that I see this as well. I just think God's looking for the smallest amount of faith. You got enough faith to give a cup of cold water to one of my disciples, you'll never lose your reward. It's the little yes. It's perhaps even a smaller yes than the Abraham story. It's almost an unarticulated yes, but it's an act of faith that God promises to reward. I find myself celebrating the little acts of faith. You know, I spoke with someone this week who told me that his daughter-in-law had who wouldn't profess faith had called him up and asked him to pray for her, and I was able to say to him, you know, I think that is an act of faith. If we're looking for little faith, if we're really that brave and really that have got that much trust in the goodness and generosity of God, I think God's looking out for just little opportunities to say, I'll reward that.
Yeah.
And maybe something as small as asking for prayer is a step of faith. In fact, I can't see how you can argue it's not.
Yeah, that's good.
And I like that here. I think, you know, just the giving of a cup of cold water to you because you're one of my disciples, that's a reward I will grant in eternity.
Yeah, that's good. Like it.
You see how we ended up at the same place there?
Same place, different ends.
Unbelievable.
There you go. This week, it is the 6th Sunday after Pentecost, because 6 comes after 5. And the readings this week are Genesis 24, verses 34 to 38, Psalm 45, verses 10 to 17, Romans 7, verses 15 to 25, and Matthew 11, verses 16 to 19, or you can go all the way up to verse 30 if you like. All of those can be found along with a whole bunch of resources, etc., at the Revised Common Lectionary online, which we get from lectionary.library.vanderbilt.edu, where you will find art, prayers, hymns, colours, printouts, all sorts of stuff that will enhance your reading, preaching, and contemplation of the readings for each week. And it's all online and really handy. And just there it is. Shall we walk through from Genesis today as well?
Sure, happy to do that. Yep.
Let's do that. I think this story for me is a really interesting one and worth reflecting on, in the sense that we read this story of Rebecca coming into the family of Abraham to be married to Isaac, and it's interesting to me that there is this, we get a lot of ideas from the older traditions, the older cultures, that there was very patriarchal, and look, it was, and that there was not much in the way of power inclination for women. What's interesting about this particular story is the way this relationship comes together, in the sense that the question is put, will you go with this man? Verse 58. And she says, I will. And so it's really interesting that she's actually given some say in this relationship, which you don't see quite often, particularly with people of power. You see that, for example, David just decides to take this wife, or Solomon takes that wife, or whatever. Very powerful men often would do that. Here we have someone who, he's got a bit of wealth at this point, the family has, but there is not this idea that I see this person, I just want her and I'll take her. There is some sort of agency given to this woman. And so when they do finally come together, you've got this beautiful relationship that seems to have been forged. She seems to desire him as much as he desires her. And let's just remember, what we see painted here sounds like it was a, hey, hello, hi, who are you? I'm this guy, I'm that girl, cool, let's get together, all right, we will. And it's all over within 10 seconds, because that's how quick it takes us to read it. But this is not something that would have happened, that quick. But there's this beautiful, as I said, this relationship that is forged here between these two people. And it just reminds me of the way that, God has this way of taking us into places where we can make these commitments and forge these relationships with others. This is not a case of God set them up. You hear this a lot, and stories like this used a lot, particularly in evangelical circles, to try and justify this idea that there is one man and one woman for each man and each woman, and that's all there is. And if you miss that one person, you miss that right person, it's all over and you're done with. And that you should go out there and pray and sit around and wait until God brings you the one that you want. I, you know, used to know a guy who described perfectly exactly the thing that he was praying that God would bring to him. And what's really beautiful is he has a beautiful marriage and wonderful kids, and his wife is nothing like the thing that he was praying for. In fact, in many ways, she's the complete opposite. But what we've got here is this idea that two people whose paths happen to cross are brought together, or come together rather. And so the idea that, God has this perfect person set up for you really does get thrown out of the water when we sit and read some of these stories closely and well. It also then, and this is slightly, in many ways, totally out of the context of the story, but it does then open up the idea that for some people, being called to singleness is just as valid. It's not that you're single because you've missed out on the one that God's got for you. It could be that you're single by choice, or it could be that you're single because that's the call that God's placed on your particular life. And there is nothing wrong with that. And we should not value those people. In many places, they're not valued any less. Unfortunately, in some places, they are. That if there's something wrong with them, if they're 45 and single, particularly if they're women, this couldn't be further from the truth. So it's looking at this story, for me, it's brought up a couple of things. First of all, it's brought up the context of the way that the way that people come together can still have the blessing of God without God being instrumental in forging it to happen. So these two actual people come together in some way, shape, or form. But because of that, we also open up to this idea that relationships are going to be different strokes for different folks, different things for different people. And I know if you really want to shake up an evangelical who's been brought up in the purity culture, simply talk to them about, what about Paul, who says some people are called to singleness and should never marry. That really shakes the feathers of some pastors who keep talking about the fact that you all should get married and you all should do this and you all should have kids and rah, rah, rah. Really? It's not what Paul said. In fact, Paul said it's probably better if you don't marry, if I remember right. So this story for me is forged in that idea that you walk through life pursuing the call that God has for you. If God happens to bring, or if someone just happens to come upon your path along the way as they pursue God's call for their life, and you can find a way to pull those two calls together and walk together in that, go for it. And that's the beauty of this story when read really closely and read really well. It's not a chess pieces being pulled together to do some sort of special thing. It's pursuing what God wants separately, but then coming together to do it together. Not because God's drawn them together, but because you just happen to cross someone's path.
Yeah. I'm always struck by the combination. I'm taking this story back to the beginning of this story rather, because this starts with a recollection of what's already happened. But if you go back to the beginning of this story, you've got Abraham with his plans for his son. You've got this servant sent on a journey with this vow. You've got him praying for success. Then you've got this this wise asking for someone who understands animals, I think. I really do. Abraham's son is a farmer, and this servant goes and he on the way he prays that someone would come and not only feed him, give him water, but also for the animals. And there's something in that for me that always says, yeah, that's just smart. Go and look for someone who's compatible with who you are. That I think that's happened here. But I'm always also struck by the caution, and this comes out in this passage that we've got in front of us. Rebecca has turned up. She's voluntarily watered the animals as well as welcomed him. He's spontaneously kind of given these gifts. And yet here we have, I don't know if they're going to let her go. I don't know if she wants to come necessarily. And there's this recounting of the story so far in a way that is asking what's next. And there just seems to be some very, very real human elements to this. Wise, discerning, but very, very human. And, another one, I mean, he doesn't seem to know, this servant doesn't seem to know if, even after all these things have happened in front of him, even after he's given his gifts, he doesn't know if these are accepted or not. He doesn't know if his trip is a success. And so he, in another act of faith, I think his whole journey is an act of faith, but in the act of faith of putting the outcome into the hands of first Rebecca's father and then him putting it in her hands. It's such an empowering story for everyone concerned, actually. And there is this sense that he's retelling this story, saying, can you see what I see? Can you see my prayers and my hopes coming together in this encounter the way I can? And clearly, both Rebecca's father and Rebecca do have that capacity. And so this journey comes about not only as a miracle from God, but also there's this very deep communal feel to this being a good decision. And I kind of like that. For me, when I got married, when I first announced my marriage, my engagement to Katie, I remember very distinctly being relieved when we announced that. My brother actually announced it in front of the church, said to everyone, Mark and Katie getting married, and there was this spontaneous applause. And while that was encouraging and everything it should be, there was something in me that thought, well, that's good. What I see as obvious, this community of a couple of hundred people also sees as obvious. And I think that was, in part, gave me confidence to move forward into what is obviously a very, very big decision for someone. I like the affirmation of the community around Rebecca. I like the affirmation of the community around Isaac in this story. Even though in some ways this looks arranged, and there would certainly be concerns around arranging for another nowadays in many cultures. There is this sense that there's just a wise, discerning affirmation in the community around these two. And I think we do very well to listen to those who know us best.
Yes.
One would assume Abraham knows his son very well. One would assume that Rebecca's father knows her very well. Perhaps that's why he says, it's up to you. Perhaps he knows that Rebecca's got a pretty strong streak in her. There's plenty to admire in him knowing his daughter this well.
Yeah.
But the other thing I'd like to point out, we'll probably touch on this in the next episode as well, is that here is a story that the coming together of these two is so miraculous and so affirmed, and we get to the end of this story and they are declared to be in love. But it's not far beyond this that this couple faces major challenges. 20 years of Rebecca's barrenness, and then twins that are fighting and really, one relates to one of these, and the other relates to where one parent relates to one of these children, and the other parent relates to the other, and there's tension here. But there's never a story here that says this was a bad idea. We thought it was a good idea, but it was a bad idea. Even though there are challenges, clearly challenges in this relationship, that's not to say it was bad or it was a mistake. In fact, I think it's almost as though the length of this story we're looking at, the getting together of Isaac and Rebecca, the length of this story kind of tells us that it's fairly important that we know that we know how this love was brought about. And I wonder if it is a reminder to us that we need to get our head around this story, because there are going to be challenges in this relationship. How often do we hear people saying, we'll be married for as long as love lasts, as long as that feeling is there? Well, it is pretty hard to argue here that the feeling stays forever and is always there, and it's always bliss for these two. Yet, I wonder if they do have a story to go back to. I wonder if the writers of Genesis are pointing to a story that Isaac and Rebecca clearly would have known very well. And I hope it carried them through, some of those tough times that are created in many ways by this relationship and this story.
Yeah, absolutely. What's interesting, though, is that, having said everything we've said, if we move into the Psalm, I'm going to be really cheeky, because the alternate for the Psalm is a reading from Song of Solomon.
Yes.
You can either read the Psalm or you can read Song of Solomon 2, verses 8 to 13. And what's interesting is, going back to what I was saying about that story, with Rebecca having agency and this being more about, that sort of, and you were touching on this too, that, Dad saying what you need to do. The Psalm seems to be reflecting an element of, this man has come to me and I'm going to be going to him because it'll rescue me as a woman. It comes across really as this Prince Charming who's going to rescue the woman and make her a princess and everything else. The Song of Solomon reading, however, is absolutely different. The Song of Solomon reading is the voice of a woman who is literally declaring her love for this man to whom, in chapter 2, so they're still only engaged. Having sex, by the way, but we won't talk about that because that might get us into trouble. However, here you've got this couple who are engaged, betrothed to each other to be married, and she's describing this one in ways that generously and specifically demonstrates her deep desire and love for this other one. And that's probably more the way I'm hearing Rebecca in this story. So for me, this is going to be short and sweet, but for me, as something to reflect on that reading, I'd probably personally choose Song of Solomon over Psalm for this coming Sunday, actually. Because I think it really does resonate more with the heart of what I'm hearing in the Genesis reading. I was throwing you a curveball, I know, because I threw.
No, I don't know if I should say. I don't know if I should say this or not, but I love Song of Solomon as a story. there's part of me that's always left thinking someone who ended up doing this 700 times. I don't know that I don't know that I'm automatically going to buy this guy's view of love. 700 wives, 300 concubines, who knows how exaggerated or general such numbers are.
Hang on, wait, are you saying he wrote it?
No, I'm not saying he wrote it.
Okay.
I'm saying it's credited to him.
Well,
and I think that's for me that's a little bit problematic, actually.
yeah. Look, I mean, Song of Songs is its more formalized title, and it is a song of beauty between two people who are in love, and none of them are identified specifically as Solomon. Well, certainly the woman's not, and the man's not either. But anyway, go on.
The tradition is that. So I always read this and think, gee, if to whatever extent this is inspired by the life of Solomon or whatever connection there is with him, I actually wouldn't be taking my love advice from Solomon.
No, I can't reach it. I was actually going to reach for Robert Alter and find out if he agrees that's about Solomon's authorship or even attribution.
Well, that attribution is pretty general, I would have thought, and pretty widely accepted. I agree with you that it may not be that Solomon's actually written it.
And even if it is, it's the story of two
reputation.
lovers.
He has a reputation as a writer. I think that's pretty fair to say.
I guess so.
Yeah.
Nothing to add?
Not really.
Romans then.
Yeah.
Where are we? Romans 7 verses 15 to 25. This has got to be one of those passages that sort of like, to me, is like the paradoxical riddle. I do what I don't want to do, and I do when I do want to do it, I don't want to do it, and all that sort of stuff. What's really interesting though is that as I reflected on this reading this week, I've always had this problem. And listeners who know me are going, "What, another one?" But I've always had this problem in that, when you're singing some worship songs, for instance, and there's all these things about, I'm sorry for what I've done. I've been a sinner and I'm sorry for what I've done. Or even in the liturgy, merciful God, our Maker and our Judge, we've sinned against you in thought, word, and deed. Being a chaplain in a Catholic aged care centre, you got that part where that goes, my fault, my most grievous fault, in the confession prayer. And many people still will sit there and beat their hearts. An Anglican priest friend of mine, during the confession, even though we don't say that in the Anglican liturgy, we'll do this as well as part of that thing. I've always been troubled by that. I've always thought, well, hang on, if we believe that what Jesus has done for us is what Jesus has done for us, or even if we believe, as I do, forget about that bit, that, we are made in original goodness, then why are we all harbored up about this? Then I had an interesting thought. An interesting thought is this. In Alcoholics Anonymous, and I know this is, to some people, it's a touchy subject, but in Alcoholics Anonymous, every single time someone gets up to speak, they will say, "Hello, my name is Mark, and I'm an alcoholic." And I did some reading around this because this popped into my head, reflecting about this. And it's sort of, my understanding is, as I can understand why this is encouraged, is the idea that you're never going to fully recover from being an alcoholic. You may never drink again. You may be sober and in sobriety for the rest of your life, or you may not. But even if you are, you'll still stand up and say, "I'm an alcoholic," because you know what you are capable of.
Yes. Yes.
And I suddenly got this thought that this is why it's important that I recognize myself as someone who fails. I don't think I'm a sinner because I have this nature of original sin. I think I have this um, humanity about me, which forgets the God image and lowers itself to a common denominator because of laziness or because of desire or because of greed or because of lust for something or whatever. Um, in fact, it's this I'm just thinking run off the top of my head now, but it could be even worth reflecting on the seven deadly sins in the idea that we don't have original sin, but these things come into play in our lives, and that causes us to do things that breach relationship with either God or with others, which is how I define sin.
Just like an alcoholic is not born into alcoholism,
That's
yet
exactly right. Yes.
it's genuinely a part of who they are.
Yeah, that's
It's
right.
genuinely a part of their makeup and their experience.
And so in reading this, while it doesn't necessarily touch on the reading itself, although, you get down to verse 24, wretched man that I am, who will rescue me from this body of death? Uh, as I started to read this the first time, I'm going, ugh, and I'm cringing a bit. I'm going, do we really have to talk like this, Paul? But as I reflected on more and more, and particularly with that illustration of what it means for somebody who is an alcoholic to say, I am an alcoholic, or an addict to say, I am an addict, whatever that happens to be. If I have this propensity, which we do, wherever it comes from and however it gets there, we have a propensity, then I think for me to recognize that and acknowledge that isn't about me wallowing in it. What it is, it's about me knowing what I'm capable of, which helps me focus on how I can steer clear of that, which should, based on this reading, move me to recognize what Jesus has done to create that way for me to go forward.
Mm. Mm. Very nice. Really like that. A couple of things I thought of. I look, as always, whenever Paul starts talking flesh and spirit, in contrast, I want to say, if you substitute ego for flesh, does this all make more sense? And I would argue that it does.
Yes, great.
The other thing I found myself a little bit stunned by, actually, I don't know that I'd read this. I delight in the law of God in my innermost self. The law of God in my innermost self. And the law of the mind. So members, I see in my members another law at war with the law in my mind. It sounds so like the call of God is the deepest core of who we are.
Yes.
Do you hear what I'm saying? That it's not the law of God that's external, but it's actually the law of sin that's external here.
Yes.
And what is internal is the very knowledge that we are made in the image of God, or the knowledge of that image. Maybe we don't explain it in those terms. But when we begin to appeal to the deepest part of us, I think Paul is coming very, very close to saying that's what appealing to the mind, to the law of God is.
Yes.
To what is right and wrong is actually the deepest thing in us, not the external that's trying to change who, the fundamental of who we are. I think I heard Paul's language a little bit differently as I read this time to the way I've heard it before, and for me that's really important. That's very hopeful statement that I can go into a conversation and appeal to the very depths of who a person is, and at the same time be appealing to the law of Christ.
Yeah. And what's really interesting about what you just said there is that now, if you take that framework, it should be very easy for you to understand, for anybody to understand, why somebody who may not be Christian will sit there and go, I don't know why I do this. Because within them is the image of God.
Yes,
And they
yes,
can see it
yes,
too. They might not
yes,
call it that, but
yeah,
it's
yeah. Makes a compelling argument, I think, for us not to appeal to shame or
yes.
appeal to appeal to that sense of I don't have it all together. Why do you know you don't have it all together? How are you
That's the
measuring
question.
that? Where is that coming from?
Yes.
Um, how do you know if maybe you have arguments with me about, against the morality of scripture or whatever? But how do you know? Why is this shame there? Is it true that religion has put it there? And I'm not saying we're beyond that capacity, but maybe there's also this element that says, I know I'm not living up to the very standards I would set for myself. And I
Mm.
set them for myself because God has set God's self deep within me.
And this should really kick at the goads of this type of evangelism that goes out to shame and harangue. Because all you're doing is
Yeah.
exasperating a condition that people already are aware of.
Yes.
Even if they
This is,
say the opposite, they
yeah.
know. They know they don't meet up to some sort of moral standard that's out there.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Which is, but it's not out
I
there.
wonder
It's
if
within. Yeah.
I wonder if this is why Paul is talking about himself in this story.
Yes.
In this account, he is almost strangely reverting to talk, I do not understand my own actions. He's not pointing to anyone. He's pointing to his own experience. I think that is probably much, much more powerful if you're trying to communicate with someone who is going through what Paul describes here, to say, this is what's happening in me, not I want to make this happen in you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm.
The gospel then, two things smack me in the head. One is, and both of these things I've stated elsewhere. If you've read my Munkin Docs daily posts on Instagram,
Mm.
you've heard me talk about these things probably more than once. The first one is in verse 19. The Son of Man came eating and drinking and said, look, a glutton and a drunkard and a friend of tax collectors and sinners, yet wisdom is vindicated by her deeds. If you're going to be called a glutton and a drunkard and a friend of tax collectors and sinners, then you will have been seen eating and drinking and hanging out with tax collectors and sinners. If you want to really live in the example of Jesus, then go out and eat and drink and hang out with tax collectors and
Mm.
sinners, or however you deem people who might be, Jesus referring to here.
Mm.
I would say Jesus didn't refer to them as that. That's what other people were referring to them as. And
This is,
that's where
yeah.
we need to be. These are the people on the fringe, the people that the leaders of society, whether in the church or politics or business or wherever, would look at these people sitting on the fringe and go, who are these scum buckets? They're just getting in
Mm.
the way of forward progress or whatever. And Jesus was like, get out of my way. This is the people I'm going to hang with. Why? He says elsewhere, because it's not the well that need the doctor, it's the sick.
Mm.
And we're bringing them to a place where they can, he's not saying that to put them down further and say they're sick, we're good. What he's saying is that you're saying that they're out of kilter with the rest of things. Well, why don't you go and help them? What Jesus is doing in going to help them is he helps them by saying, hey, you're actually no different to these other people. You have what they have, you just don't recognize it yet. So I would say, first of all, from this reading, if you're being called, something that's not very nice by people who are on the inside because you're hanging out with people on the outside, take it as a compliment. Jesus obviously did. The second one comes from the last part of the reading, which is that very famous thing about weary and carrying burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble of heart, and you will find your rest for my souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. A couple of things, and both of them pretty much come from verse 29. First of all, a yoke was a term that was given to the teaching of a rabbi. And so when Jesus here is talking about take my yoke upon me, he's saying take my teaching upon you, take my teaching upon you and learn from me. So there's actually two things that are happening here. It's not just accepting the teachings of Jesus or even taking them on your life. It's actually allowing them to transform and change you and being opened and awakened to the things that these teachings bring. But notice how this teaching comes and how this learning comes. Gentleness, humble of heart, and rest for your soul. And this is incredibly important. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. This whole idea that, oh, you got to drag the cross was heavy and it was splintered and you got to throw it on your back and it'll be bloodied and my yoke is easy and my burden is light. If anything you're throwing at other people is a burden on them, that I would argue is not the gospel of Jesus. The teachings of Jesus are easy and they are light. The learning of walking that path should be easy and light. I think we make it more complicated what it has to be, or we look at it and say this is too hard, not because the action is too hard, but because of what's holding us back from doing those things is too hard. And that humble of heart, gentleness and humble of heart. If I'm, Jesus says elsewhere to the leaders of the church of his time, the synagogue of his time, he said, you snaky brood of vipers, you weigh up the burdens on people's backs and do not even lift a finger to help them carry them. What we see here is a completely different approach to what he's talking about. My yoke is easy, my burden is light, gentle, humble of heart. That's the yoke you carry. That's going to bring rest to your soul. It's not going to lay crap on that makes life more hard. It's not going to lay stuff on that makes worshiping more hard, that makes engaging with God more hard. If anything, it's going to make it easier and it's going to bring rest and a easiness to your life. I know that runs against the goads of so many things that a lot of people teach out there, but I cannot read this passage and hear Jesus' heart sharing anything else. I'm not saying it's not difficult, but it's not a burden, and those two things are very
yeah. I often use this verse to remind myself that, especially when it comes to forgiveness and letting go rather than holding the grudge, I remind myself of this because I think Jesus is kind of saying here, my yoke may seem difficult and there's work to do, but it is easier. The claim is it is easier. And that's very significant to me. I think that there's, as I read the Gospels, there's a very anti-religion element to Jesus. And I think Jesus, in the face of this, this refusal to believe, which I think is put forward in this this wonderful little, we played the flute for you, you did not dance, we wailed, you did not mourn. What do you want us to do? We've done the two extremes. John the Baptist has come and he's refrained from eating and drinking. The Son of Man comes, drinks, and you name him just the same. There's this sense that he's saying, for this generation, no matter what we do, you're choosing not to believe. But come and follow me. Come and learn from me, because I will make it easier. Now, so often we want to translate that into I will make it easy. I'm not sure I always buy that. But I will buy and I will defend that even when it comes to the difficulty of letting go of the things other people do against us, I think forgiveness is one of the most difficult things. But I would suggest that holding the grudge for a lifetime is harder and more costly and does more damage. I think this is one of those passages where Jesus is saying, is contrasting believing in him to the generation that's saying, I'm only going to believe in myself, no matter who you throw at me, whether it's John the Baptist who comes in a relatively conservative way, or it's me who comes in a way that's just a bit too radical and welcoming. You're choosing not to believe. But for those who will choose, those who will listen, you will find this path easier. You will find my humble path easier. And yet, and again, you have this contrast between these people who essentially, Jesus is saying, no matter what we do, you will not see. And people who are saying, I will humbly come and learn. Beautiful imagery of the learner is one who doesn't see it all. So this is another act of faith. It's another act of trust. I've often said this to myself as I've gone about ministry. Actually, I've reminded myself of this verse and said, Mark, go Jesus' way in this conversation or in this decision. It may be hard, but it is easier.
Yes. Yeah. And that's the paradox I was talking about.
Yeah.
And I agree 100%. Whew. There we go. The 6th Sunday after Pentecost. Genesis 24 verses 34 to 38, and then 42 to 49 and 58 to 67. Psalm 45 verses 10 to 17, or Song of Solomon chapter 2 verses 8 to 13. Romans 7 verses 15 to 30, and Matthew 11 verses 16 to Romans 7 verses 15 to 25, Matthew 11 verses 16 to 30. All those readings are at, as I said, lectionary.library.vanderbilt.edu. If you couldn't make sense of the mess dog's breakfast that I just presented there, we'll go back to the start of the show and listen to what I said then, because I think I actually got it right then. Mate, thanks for today's conversation.
Great to talk, Mark.
And as always, folks, if you've got things you want to add, share, whatever, if you're watching on YouTube, drop them in the comments. If you are listening on the podcast, then I think if you're on Spotify, there should be a question there. So what do you think of today's show? Click that, send us a note, or send us an email at betweentwosundays@gmail.com, or visit Mark's website, barefootfollower.life, or mine, monkeydocs.podio.com, or send me a DM at Instagram at monkeydocs is the handle. Mate, until next week, have a good one.
You too.
Cheers, folks. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time for another Between Two Sundays. Bye for now.
See you later.